You're listening to Sustainably Geeky, the podcast for everyday environmentalists.
Hi, you're listening to Sustainably Geeky, episode 69. Today I'm speaking with Vanessa Conroy from Feminist Communities for Climate Justice about the work they're doing to achieve climate justice informed by feminist and community development principles. I'm really excited to have her on. I attended one of their webinars last month and learned about this great organization, and I thought it was also very timely for Women's History Month. So Vanessa, thanks so much for being on. And can you start by just sharing a little bit about the history of the organization and the work that you're doing?
Well, thanks so much for having me as well. It's very cool to get to do stuff like this about the project. So, Feminist Communities for Climate Justice is a project based in Ireland, and it's a joint project between the National Women's Council of Ireland, who are basically a non-government organisation, an NGO here in Ireland, who are entirely focused around achieving women's rights and gender equality in Ireland. And also between Community Work Ireland is the second partner in the project, who are basically another membership organisation in Ireland who are focused on community work, community development, on according to a certain set of values, always with social justice and achieving equality for those who are furthest left behind in particular. And so a bit about the project partners. So the Women's Council represent about 200 organisations across the entirety of Ireland, so the Republic and Northern Ireland as well, from a diversity of backgrounds, sectors and locations. And we celebrated 50 years just last year, so this is year 51 of the National Women's Council. But what's been pointed out recently, and by Community Work Ireland themselves, who are a member of the Women's Council at an AGM recently, was that they hadn't been doing a lot in the climate space, and particularly that gendered impact of the climate crisis. And so this project was basically born out of kind of taking that note into account and then seeing what could we do about this issue. And so now kind of part of our strategic plan here at the Women's Council is to develop basically a feminist approach to climate analysis, a feminist approach to climate organizing as well. And really, again, for women and girls, but also for other groups in Ireland who might be very like socioeconomically disadvantaged or disadvantaged because of their identity group as well. And then Community Work Ireland have been doing work on climate justice in Ireland for about a decade, which is quite long in terms of the Irish context, because I know in America, kind of environmental justice and climate justice issues would have arisen out of the civil rights movement. So the conversation's been going on a lot longer there. It's still relatively new to Ireland. And so to have somebody who's been doing the work for 10 years is kind of, that's a long time in terms of the climate justice conversation here. And really they're kind of, Community Work Ireland has about 800, probably closer to 1,000 members who are groups and individuals at this point, who basically engage in community work and community development, but particularly with the most disadvantaged individuals and communities in the country, and always ascribing to a set of values about pursuing social justice and about the collective victory over the individual victory, and always kind of empowering people, creating the conditions for empowerment rather than empowering people as an individual yourself, creating the conditions that the entirety of the community is empowered and has their consciousness raised, and always helping them to identify the structural issues that are causing inequality so that we can kind of really start having those macro scale conversations. And really, what Community Work Ireland were saying when they raised this issue at the AGM was that they were hearing from community workers on the ground who were like, we can see the climate crisis is going to be an issue, particularly for really disadvantaged folks, or that it was already an issue for really disadvantaged folks. But I think a lot of people would agree about climate and that it feels like such a huge space, such a huge problem, and they didn't feel confident about communicating it with, particularly with groups who might be like, I'm thinking about getting to the end of the week, not to 2030 or to 2050 or anything like that. But also helping those folks realize that the climate crisis was having an issue on their everyday lives as well, and how they might organize around that, how they might begin their own kind of small scale community adaptation schemes as well. And so at the heart of this project is that kind of concept of climate justice, that intersection of the climate crisis and social justice issues, and that we have a really big gap in that kind of data in Ireland. And so this project really helps to equip people who are working with the most disadvantaged, but also to bring everybody kind of up to speed in terms of climate literacy and how that interacts with social justice issues.
Wow, so you guys are very busy.
We are.
That is amazing work that you're doing, and I love to hear that it's happening in a country that I'm living in, but at all, really. And we've started hearing, I think, in the more recent climate and environmental movement, I'd say in the last decade or a little more, like you said, more about how much impact these issues do have on marginalized communities disproportionately. There's always been a worry about the problems that are happening, but now we're really starting to see more focus on, I think, those segments of the population that are much more, you know, less equipped, I would say, to actually deal with it. So on that note, a lot of times we hear about climate issues or biodiversity loss issues, and we also hear about social justice issues, and people think those are two completely separate things. But this mindset that it's actually very intersectional is becoming more prevalent, and that's something that your organization recognizes. So, can you explain how these issues are connected, and why someone who is worried about the environment should also be concerned with social issues and vice versa?
So really, I think kind of at the very core of the kind of climate crisis issue is the fact that a lot of research has kind of shown us that the impacts, as you said, won't be felt evenly, and particularly if you're already disadvantaged, whether that is a kind of an identity-based disadvantage or whether it's a socioeconomic disadvantage, you're going to feel the worst of the impact. And we see it at a global and a local level. So, for example, we might see particularly in the likes of small island nation states or sub-Saharan Africa, where we can see maybe the more extreme, dramatic, very visible impacts of drought, of sea levels swallowing up smaller islands. But it's also talking about the fact that no matter where you are in the world, and there's a lot of research showing us that equality within countries is kind of growing at a quicker pace than equality between countries now. And thinking about how the climate crisis will impact people, because we are starting to see it in Ireland more so. I think it's becoming more real in the fact that we've had really bad flooding, particularly in Cork and Middleton, where we had a month's worth of rainfall in the space of a day last year. This week alone, we've had snow, we've had hail, we've had flooding. The sun is out right now, all in the space of 1 week. So we're seeing, and our own climate policy is showing us that our frosty and snowy season is starting to shorten. We're getting more extreme raining and flooding events, and that our summers are getting hotter, and particularly October in Ireland last year was very hot when it's supposed to be the time of year when it's really starting to get a bit cold in this country. And I think kind of at the heart of it is that we also know that there are emissions in our atmosphere that are causing climate change, that are causing the climate crisis and the effects that we're seeing. And we know that not everybody on this planet has contributed an equal amount of those emissions. Particularly, we're talking about kind of countries in, like, for lack of a better term, the global north, and kind of the historical and continuing impacts of colonization of many countries, in that the resources from these countries in the global south were basically taken for kind of the wealth and development of countries in the global north. And those were the ones who really put the bulk of the emissions into the atmosphere. But the people who had their resources taken from them are people who we find are more kind of socioeconomically disadvantaged and are also feeling the worst of the effects of the climate crisis as well, particularly in terms of drought and extreme weather. And kind of when we're talking about the fact that also that these countries have the least resources to respond, and we're talking about things like at COP, when we're talking about that loss and damage fund and who is responsible really for kind of coughing up the bill so that everybody can kind of be as safeguarded from the impacts of the climate crisis as possible. But when we're talking about kind of that intersection of social justice and the climate crisis at the global and the local, a little acronym that's been used in this space to kind of have that conversation more easily is MAPA, and that MAPA for most affected people and areas. And that can allow us to have that conversation talking about the areas of the globe that we see more of the impact happening in, but also the people, even within kind of maybe countries where we're not seeing as much extreme weather just yet. So, for example, we're talking about the likes of the Black, Indigenous, and people of color. We're talking about women and girls. We're talking about the LGBTQI plus community. We're talking about disabled people, Roma people, and so on and so forth. And so additionally, these groups are less likely to kind of have that socioeconomic safeguarding if there are kind of incidents like flooding. But also, we're talking about kind of policy tools like adaptation and mitigation policies, like carbon taxation, the transition to electric vehicles, and so on and so forth. You likely, if you're already living in a socioeconomic disadvantaged community, you don't have the means to kind of safeguard against kind of the regressive impacts of carbon taxation, and you probably don't have the upfront money to get a car, an electric vehicle, no matter how good the grants from your government are to encourage you to do that. And basically what we see is those grants and the kind of the early adoption benefits of things like retrofitting your home or purchasing an electric vehicle are going to people who can already make those upfront costs. So likely the middle to upper class earners. And we see that people who could really benefit from them, people who are already really struggling with energy bills or putting food on the table, aren't seeing those benefits at all. And additionally, these kind of marginalized groups are less likely to be represented in our decision making spaces. And I think I always think of Greta Thunberg's words of pale, male, and stale, in that a lot of our decision makers, no matter what kind of area we're talking about, are still a lot of kind of older white men, likely able bodied, likely cisgendered. And so there's a lot of perspectives that are being left out, and particularly the unique impacts of the climate crisis for certain other groups that aren't white, able bodied, cisgendered, older men. And so you don't have policy, climate policy, whether that is a global kind of piece like coming from COP, or maybe a supranatural kind of one from the EU, which influences a lot of climate policy in its member states. And then you don't see it even reflected at national or even very local climate policy at all, because if you're not having a seat at that table of decision making, then how is your input being heard when they're writing up these policies as well? And so that's why we really see kind of the climate issue and the social issue really intersectional, and because there is a potential opportunity that the existing inequalities that we have are basically sustained into 2030 or to 2050, or there's the very real potential that these existing inequalities are exacerbated, and then we have what we like to call here green sexism or low emissions homelessness, in that the problems are retained but they're low emissions, or that we're in a green economy while they're still happening.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that, in your first introduction, you mentioned that you guys are focusing on not just empowering individuals, but changing the system as a whole. Because I think a lot of times people look at the problem and that's their solution, right? It's a very capitalist, like, what can the individual do? How can we shift the blame to the person, make them feel more guilty when they're already probably stressed about it? And I think it's great that there's work being done to actually change the system, because the individual should be trying and can do so much, and then it needs to be more of something that, like you said, gives everybody a better chance to get the car, or be a part of the solution that they can't do on their own. So I love that you're kind of looking at it holistically like that. I want to kind of build on some of what you just said. When I was researching your organization, on your website, it says there is no policy area or crisis that we are currently experiencing that does not have a link to climate breakdown. All policy is climate policy. And that really spoke to me, because I've always known that, but I've never actually seen it explicitly put into words like that. So it was like a wake-up call, like, wow, yeah, that's the thing I've been trying to to communicate to people. So can you expand on this and explain what you mean by that?
I think really what we're talking about is that when we're talking about particularly things like our 2030 emissions targets or our 2050 emissions targets, depending on what country you live in the world, but it's like kind of the majority is looking like by 2050 we want to have net zero emissions nationally. And so really what that involves is that we can't just kind of silo climate and environment as their own policy area, because they're all it's inevitably tackled and touched by every other policy area. So we can't talk about the role that transport plays without talking about, for example, how we're planning our communities, when we're talking about things like, oh, rural communities are really cut off from good public transport links. So how do we solve this? Is it about creating better public transport system, or is it about building amenities into these kind of rural areas so that we have more of maybe what we might call a 15-minute city? But it's also the fact that every single policy area will need to cut its emissions by a certain amount in order for us to meet those carbon emissions targets. So it could be half by 2030 and then net zero by 2050. So it can't just be, okay, we do like 70% of our energy green by 2030 and then we do nothing else, because energy obviously has a huge part to play in a number of other sectors. So for example, here in Ireland by 2030 we want to have 70% of our electricity to be generated by green means, and largely here in Ireland that means it's going to be wind energy, because that's kind of the primary means we really generate our green energy supplies by. And the thing is, if we don't meet that target, that has a knock-on effect for the rest, because if we don't have that kind of green energy production, then we're using coal, oil, gas to create the electricity we need for the likes of electric transport, for electric heating in residential buildings and in kind of public buildings as well. So there is a knock-on effect in that if one sector doesn't kind of meet their goals, then it has an impact on the rest. But it's also the fact that there is kind of this issue, and some like where we treat climate as a single issue, and it's clearly not that, because we're talking about the earth that we all call home, and we're talking about everything that we create in our economies and in our societies, even if we are far removed from those natural processes, particularly in the production of our food. It all is generated from natural resources. And so if we're talking about in particular transport, we are talking about, like, okay, if we're moving to electronic vehicles, where are we getting the lithium sources for that? How are we producing the electricity for that? And how are we laying out the roads for that? Do we need more roads, or do we need more public transport? And then when we're talking about those kinds of conversations, we then necessarily need to go into our planning policy and our planning permissions, and that if we need to build more roads, we need to keep an in mind the carbon emissions for that sector. And it's like, well, if we're talking about roads and we're talking about construction and planning, whose carbon emissions ceiling is it really? And it kind of gets to a point where you realize, as you're having these conversations, that it's slightly ridiculous to have these policy areas all siloed off from each other, and particularly climate, because it will touch all of them. They all have impacts on our carbon emissions, and they all impact on the climate crisis. And we can't treat climate as a separate policy area without having a discussion on how every other policy area, whether it's health, transport, food production, agriculture, and so on and so forth, because every single aspect of our day-to-day lives will have to change by 2050 if we want to have that net zero economy. So how we travel, how we use energy, how we construct buildings, the kinds of jobs we create, what kinds of like tourism, do we encourage more tourism or do we not? There's a there's so many conversations that we need to have, and all of these conversations will inevitably be tied to a government policy area, and inevitably all of those government departments are going to have to keep an eye on sectoral ceilings or carbon emission ceilings up to 2030 and up to 2050. And so we would say all policy is climate policy, because every single policy decision we make from now until at least 2050, and we'll see what happens after that, will have to be made in mind with the climate crisis and with those emission ceilings, because every sector basically has to do its equal part, because they all produce carbon emissions, and they're all involved in climate policy as a result. You can't write about climate policy on its own without paying attention to the parts of our societies and economies that produce carbon emissions.
So again, the theme is intersectionality. Everything's related. Everything affects everything else.
Mhm.
So we've established, that these climate impacts affect certain groups disproportionately. But can you give examples of specific ways in which they do, and maybe what some of these groups are, or why they're considered marginalized and therefore affected?
So really kind of coming back to that concept of MAPA, of most affected people and places, they tend to be the groups who are going to be hit the hardest by the climate crisis, are the ones we can kind of already identify within social justice issues, within equity and equality issues, as groups who are oppressed, if you will, by our current kind of socioeconomic systems. So we're talking about the likes of women and girls, disabled people, people of color, indigenous groups and communities, migrants and asylum seekers, the LGBTQI plus community, but also children and older people, really importantly, because there are kind of impacts with ageism in relation to the climate crisis in particular, especially how we leave this world for the generation who comes after us, and also for the ability to can children take part in that climate decision making effectively, or are they essentially locked out of that as well? And we're also talking about the likes of traveler and Roma communities, and then kind of a real catch-all then is that socioeconomic disadvantaged. And if you're belonging to one of these MAPA groups, chances are you probably do have an element of socioeconomic disadvantage in your life. Um, it's the fact that these groups already face kind of oppression, systemic oppression, that puts them at a disadvantage in the first place. And kind of some things we talked about before, their experiences might not be reflected in policy that we write up in our mitigation and adaptation strategies. Um, their attempts to transition to net zero in a kind of green business as usual model, which is kind of what the majority of governments seem to be pursuing, means that the existing kind of infrastructure and laws and societal attitudes won't change. They'll just be green, if you will, and it'll continue to put these people at a disadvantage. And again, coming back to that kind of, for example, carbon taxation, because it seems to be kind of a lever that a lot of governments use throughout the world, and with good reason, because we will have to kind of be encouraged to move away, obviously, from high carbon resources, whether that is kind of solid fuels or whether it is motor oil and so on and so forth. But the thing is, when we're talking about things like energy use in particular, this is like an inelastic demand in that it doesn't matter how much that price goes up. We all need a certain amount of energy to get by in our day to day lives. Like, for example, even things as simple as running a refrigerator, you're always going to need a certain amount of energy or to pay for a certain amount of electricity in order to run a refrigerator or to run a freezer or to keep the heating on. And so, if you have this inelastic demand, and you know, particularly if you are a caretaker, that you will always need a certain amount of energy in order to keep the people that you care for fed and warm, it doesn't matter how much carbon taxation they heap on top. You're always going to have to basically consume a certain amount of energy, and that carbon taxation hurts you more as a result, particularly if you are poor, particularly if you are disabled, and you might have to run life-saving equipment to ensure that you can, like, live your day-to-day life, particularly if you're in a Roma or traveler community and you might live in a caravan or a trailer. There are serious implications for how much energy that these communities need to use to kind of keep their trailers warm in particular. And so basically what you see is that you're locked in to this kind of fossil fuel dependency, particularly if you don't have the disposable income to buy that electric car or to retrofit your home so that it's super energy efficient. And then you're basically, that dependency that you have on fossil fuels, because of your socioeconomic disadvantage, you're essentially punished through carbon taxation because you can't afford to move away from solid fuels, or you can't afford to move away from motor oil. Um, and so that would kind of be some of the examples like of socioeconomic disadvantage, but we're also talking about access to food. And we saw here kind of in Europe at the beginning of last year, where the impacts of the cost of energy crisis across the continent in combination with the climate crisis meant that certain forms of food, and like particularly fruit and vegetables, suddenly came into really scarce supply. And what you see here then is that either that food becomes entirely unavailable, or the supply and demand kicks in and the price of that goes up. And then suddenly you're having something as incredible necessity like food is suddenly locked out of reach of people who might really need it the most. I mean, of course, we all need food, but if you're really poor, that suddenly becomes incredibly hard for you to get a really basic necessity. And that is, again, tied to the climate crisis having an impact on how food is grown, how food is transported. And particularly if we're talking about a global scale, if you're living an agrarian lifestyle and you rely directly on the land to produce your food, if the rain cycle changes even by a month or 2 months, if you see really hot sun or you don't see enough sun, then your source of food and your kind of relied on food supply is compromised almost immediately. And kind of at the center of our project again is really the impacts that the climate crisis has on women, and the fact that women, no matter where they are in the world, are more likely to be hardest hit by the impact of the climate crisis, both globally and locally, but particularly for our project, again, it's that domestic Irish conversation. because women are socioeconomically disadvantaged compared to men, whether it's through the kind of gender pay or gender pension gap, or whether we're talking about cultures where women aren't allowed to work, where women aren't allowed to own their own wealth or land or resources. We see a socioeconomic disadvantage globally. And then again, that caregiving piece, which is also a really important part of our project, that is key to how women experience this disadvantage, because that gendered, culturally assigned role of caregiver for women means you are a sustenance provider. It means you are looking after other people. It means you're using transport and energy in different ways. And you are living in systems where public transport has been designed for a male breadwinner's work commute. And that doesn't suit if you're trying to get on a bus with a pram, or if you're trying to get on a train with a pram, or if you're somebody who is disabled and you're trying to get on a bus, and so on and so forth. And it's also, again, that pale male stale piece that we don't have a lot of women at our climate making, at our climate decision making spaces, or in many of our decision making spaces at all. And again, if that voice is not at the decision making table, then those experiences are not heard, and then they're not reflected in our policy conversations. We also see that in terms of climate migration, where basically the climate crisis displaces you from your home, whether it becomes too hot to live somewhere, whether you see basically your community get swallowed up by rising sea levels, and so on and so forth. We see that kind of 80% of the world's climate migrants are women and children, but also the majority of deaths related to extreme weather events are also women, up to 5 times the rate of men. And they're also disproportionately represented in deaths related to air pollution as well. And again, that fact that they're socioeconomically disadvantaged means that if you are basically in a country where you are allowed to own your own wealth, but you are always existing kind of at that gender gap disadvantage, if there is something like a flood or a storm or an earthquake or so on and so forth, and you lose your home or you lose your land, you have less kind of economic resources to recoup those losses or to start over again. And we also see, particularly with that gender pension gap, in terms of energy poverty, where you're spending a lot more money than you should of your annual income on keeping your house powered or keeping your house warm. We see women falling time and time again at higher rates than men into energy poverty. And really, quite sadly, research kind of from mainland Europe has shown us that there's a higher winter mortality rate for older women because they tend to outlive men, and because of that gender pension gap, it gets more and more expensive to keep your house warm. And so you see older women basically freezing to death in their own homes, which is, it's just incredibly, incredibly sad. And it's because we haven't done kind of that necessary, we haven't filled in that gender data gap on these areas sufficiently. And again, another real key community, I think, to use as an example here is the disabled community. And always what we think about kind of was that transition from plastic to paper or cardboard straws, which so many disabled communities came out against and said, we need these straws. There are certain disabled people who really need to use plastic straws in particular to be able to eat and drink food. The cardboard straws are no good. They go soggy after you leave them a certain amount of time. The metal straws are more of a choking hazard for some people. But these changes were kind of just brought in because they were seen as, environmentally good, but they didn't suit an enormous cohort of people who weren't consulted at all. And another thing we need to be kind of careful of is when we pedestrianize streets, because we see time and time again, we are not taking into proper consideration where disabled parking spaces are going to be, because there are always going to be a cohort of people who simply can't do all of the walking. They might have they might need to use a wheelchair, they might have limited mobility in their legs, they might have extreme fatigue from a chronic health condition. But there's also the fact that for people who are visually impaired, the kind of what we call the texture between cycle paths and footpaths and roads, it's so key that those are all kind of texturally distinct from each other if you need to use a cane as to aid your vision, because you will have people who are visually impaired walking into cycle paths or walking into roads because the texture of those surfaces hasn't been taken into consideration. And I mean, we could go on and on and on, but those are just a kind of a few key examples that I think of.
And these are things that I think most people would recognize are issues, but maybe they don't make the connection that they're connected to climate or environmental issues. So I think it's very important to make that distinction, because a lot of times I think we just take for granted that, yeah, that's just how it is. There's nothing we can do about it. That's just how our cities are structured or organized or whatever. So thank you for sharing all of those examples. You mentioned care workers, and that was actually my next question. Care work is crucial to the functioning of all societies all around the world, and usually, a lot of the times, it's not paid work, and it's kind of underappreciated because of that. It's just, again, taken for granted that the woman or whoever the carer is going to be at home doing these things so that the quote unquote breadwinner can go out and bring in money, and that is considered the more valuable work, unfortunately. So, can you explain how the climate crisis can disproportionately affect care workers as a result of these challenges? And I know you kind of touched on it, but if there's anything additional you'd add to that.
Yes, so kind of as you said, as I touched on a little earlier, care and whether that is paid or unpaid caregiving duties are kind of really key to how some people experience the climate crisis. And again, because we have that cultural and gendered assignment of care work largely to women and girls, we see it at the center and kind of as a key piece of women's experience of the climate crisis in particular. And again, it is kind of related to how care makes you change your method of transport or change where you go compared to somebody who might just be a breadwinner who's just going from home to work and work to home again. But if you're a caregiver, maybe you're dropping somebody to school, maybe you're picking up some groceries, maybe you're checking in on another relative before you get to work. But it's also care impacts how you use that transport, but also how you gather food and water and how energy is used, and particularly how environmental degradation impacts your day-to-day life. And so, for example, again, if you have sudden deforestation in your area because maybe a multinational company has decided we want to level all of those trees because we want to use it as agricultural land, largely probably for the production of beef, suddenly your firewood source is gone and you need to think about where am I going to get wood or another suitable source of tinder to light a fire to keep my family or my house warm. Again, water sources drying up from drought means that women may have to walk further and further to get a suitable supply of water. And I say women here because it is largely women who are involved in the provision of these resources. Um, in Ireland in particular, what we've seen is that research has shown us that basically carrying out care work in our current transport infrastructure as it exists means the majority of women are really reliant on owning a car. Even within kind of Dublin, where you assume the public transport links are the best in this country, we still see kind of we're hitting nearly 80% of women and basically saying a car, and they use the word necessity. It's an absolute necessity to own a car because it is things like, if you have three kids in the back of the car and maybe you need to take a pram or maybe you need to take a chair, like a car seat, you like getting those kids onto a bus or onto a train or taking the pram onto one of these forms of public transport. It's incredibly cumbersome because the system has not been designed with that kind of need in mind. Again, it's been designed to help people like workers or students get to a university or to a workplace. And it hasn't really been designed with anything else in mind aside from that. And that's because a lot of the data we gather is largely from getting people from home to work. And we kind of put things like getting people going to creche, picking up shopping and so on in this kind of miscellaneous data pile. And it's like not properly kind of sorted out so that we can design transport according to those miscellaneous, and I use air quotes here, trips, which are essential. And the fact that the current economic system could not exist without that care work, really. We also like to say in our project in particular, and part of our feminist approach, is that recognition of caring work, whether that is something like looking after somebody in the home, whether you're working in a nursing home in the formal sector, it might be teaching, it might be healthcare, it might be community work or social care. Care work is low carbon work and it's therefore green work. It doesn't require many, if any, extraction of natural resources from the environment. It tends to be greener even than the jobs we typically have in these green jobs conversations like geoengineering, green energy production, retrofitting. Care work is greener than all of these things because it doesn't really require any extraction of resources. Again, like I said, and if anything underlined how essential care work was, it was the COVID-19 pandemic and those lockdowns. What was the work that continued when a lot of people were told to stay at home? It was teachers teaching over the likes of Skype or Zoom, and it was people working in nursing homes, people working in hospitals, and people as ever, unseen kind of by policy and government spaces, working to look after people in the home as well, making sure they're fed, making sure they're washed, making sure they get enough sleep, and so on and so forth. And so, for example, education is kind of called as a really key part of that green transition, and that we need to make sure everybody has a level of climate literacy going into 2030 and to 2050, so that people know what that transition involves, if people need to upskill or get new basically training and jobs if they have to leave high carbon kind of industries, and learn kind of about new green jobs, new green forms of energy, new climate science. The list goes on and on. And education is such a key part. What we're seeing right now, teachers continue to be very badly paid. It continues to be incredibly difficult to get a full-time contract in kind of third level education in universities or colleges. And we're seeing in Ireland, because of that kind of rental crisis, we're seeing teachers basically being forced from their posts because they can't afford to live near the schools that they're teaching in. So we know it's a really crucial part of the green transition, but we're not valuing it as if it is a crucial part of that green transition. Not in the same way that we'd be paying the likes of people who are directly involved in climate science, who are directly involved in kind of green energy production. We just don't see that same level of value, whether that is kind of societal level value in the policy space or in terms of pay or protections. We don't see it for things like teaching and healthcare. In fact, we see these as job sectors where basically wages and protections are being eroded day on, day in, day out. And it's not just here. We see it particularly kind of with the attack on the NHS in particular in England. We see it with kind of the kind of continuous attacks on what can and can be taught in educational spaces in America, in particular, the kind of growing list of banned books, and you can't talk about critical race theory. It's a constantly just squashing down of these sectors, while other jobs kind of in the typical green job space are basically being allowed to open up and expand because it's seen as more so necessary work to that green transition. And of course it is, because we do need retrofitted homes and we do need green energy production. But if you don't have people who are nurtured, who are fed, who are grown, like, educated to do those jobs, then it's kind of a moot, because where is your workforce? And care is really important part to that. But also the fact that to create healthy communities, a healthy democracy, people who are invested in these green transitions, you need care work to look after people. We all throughout our lives have needed to be cared for at some point. We'll probably need to care for people at some point in our lives ourselves. When we are like, newborn children, we need to be cared for. And likely when we get towards kind of the end of our lives, when we're quite elderly, we'll also need to be cared for as well. And it doesn't matter what kind of pay bracket you're in. Care is always going to be a part of our societies. And so basically, we want it to be valued as such. And also because it is such a key part, particularly women's experience of the climate crisis too.
Yeah, you were talking about how educators, especially, a lot of times in higher education institutions, are being pushed out or unable to even afford where they're living. And I was at a workshop a few months ago about higher education and their role in the climate transition, basically. And that was a recurring theme, was that it's becoming harder, one, to find the jobs, and then to get tenure. They're really kind of discouraging that track. They're making it more, they want to hire a bunch of adjuncts, so they want to, string you along and have you do 10 other things. You have to teach, but you have to research, and you have to mentor, and you have to publish and do all these things. So yeah, I think the expectations for what is required are becoming a little outrageous, but also the available jobs, like you said, are not quite there. So I think definitely a restructuring or reorganizing of our priorities is needed for a lot of these things.
And even thinking about in Ireland in particular, PhD students are still fighting to make more than a minimum wage on their stipends. And so it's like, these are the people who you're expecting to go out and do this incredibly crucial research on the climate crisis, and they can't even make a minimum wage,
Or get paid to speak, because a lot of times they're just used to fill in for instructors as a class or two, but they're not getting paid for that, I've found out. So yeah, it's a big problem to expect people to be able to move forward in a specific field, but then they don't have the means to do it.
And that's like, even with like a lot of climate stuff right now, like particularly at a community level, when we're talking about even small things like community gardens, organizing kind of litter picks, organizing like, protecting biodiversity in areas. It's all assumed, particularly by the state right now, that this is volunteer work that you do because you care out of the goodness of your heart, and you're not really expecting a wage for it. You're just doing it because you're passionate about it. And this is work that's going to be crucial for that green transition, particularly at a community level, to make people, because people do have disenchantment with government. Like, they come and go, but there will always be a certain level of disenchantment if you're not basically, if you don't agree with the government parties who are currently elected. And so you want to make sure that there is a grounding within the community at the grassroots level of climate work. But if it's always unpaid work, if it's always voluntary work, if it's always work you have to kind of already have an interest in, um, then you're only going to get the same people turning up every single time. And if they are always unpaid, and if they need to keep up a job on top of it, and if they need to afford childcare on top of it, and if they're experiencing the housing crisis, the rental crisis on top of it, those people are going to get burnt out. And then who do you expect to step in to continue that work? And that's another piece about that kind of valuing different forms of green work that aren't in industries like, like engineering, like the typical STEM industries that we see. And also a part of that gendered piece is that all of the kind of jobs really in the green jobs discussion are male dominated jobs as well. And so there isn't really a part for, like, for female dominated industries in the just transition policy as it exists right now. And bringing care work into that space is kind of key for making sure that women are actually part of that employment and economic transition too.
Yeah, you just made me think about obviously volunteer work has been a crucial part of the environmental movement for years, for decades. But some people are actually now not only not getting paid for it, but they are getting punished economically or financially, or even arrested in a lot of cases, like water defenders and protesters who are being put in jail, or they're not working for days or months at a time because they're protesting. So not only are they not getting paid, but they're kind of, in some ways, they could be hurting future chances of employment. So it's an interesting thing to think about in that way too, as care workers, the sacrifices being made.
Exactly.
Well, we've talked a lot about the problems. So let's talk now about how feminist communities for climate change are working to address these inequities. What are some specific actions or maybe programs you guys are working on?
So specifically, kind of the base, kind of the underlying base of the project is creating an awareness of that domestic impact of the climate crisis on women and girls and marginalized communities in Ireland. Because again, that is a big data gap and a big policy data gap that we have in this country. And so that knowledge is power piece is really key, because especially when you talk about that kind of care work as green work piece, there's always a moment where people are like, I hadn't even considered it that way, because you don't, because care jobs aren't in those conversations. And like, we what we do, myself and Colette, my colleague, is that it's only two of us on this project, but we're lucky to have some funding from the government for us to do this work for a while. And so what we do where we can, and particularly because we want to bring these conversations to communities who are so often left out of them, is that we go to them and we present a workshop on kind of basically climate justice 101, and particularly how the climate crisis interacts with problems going on in Ireland right now. So for example, the housing crisis is something that is really impacting people all over this country. And so we try to make the connections there. The impact on transport, particularly for rural communities, but also for migrants and asylum seekers in this country as well. That's also a really key issue. Kind of how energy costs, how health, and all of these other areas are already kind of being impacted by the climate crisis, and that you're already seeing them in your day-to-day lives. It's just those connections basically haven't been made yet. And it's about making those connections. We give them that talk, and then we let them go into groups and kind of start figuring it out. How is this already impacting our lives? And then more importantly, we ask, what are the skills that you have right now that maybe you could make a difference at a community level? And then what do you recognize? Because again, we don't want it to just be that piece where the onus is on the individual or on the individual community. What problems are structural problems that we need to kind of fight for change from our government, or maybe we need to go to the EU level? and kind of demand for voices to be included in certain policy spaces. So that would kind of be one piece. Another quite sizable piece of the project is a certificate program that we're running with Maynooth University's Department of Applied Social Studies. And that's a QQI level 7, so just below a bachelor's degree. So a specialization is what we call it. And the degree program is called Community Work in a Changing Ireland, Feminist Climate Justice. And basically, this particular certificate program always kind of evolves in, like, basically in response to the needs of what community workers have identified as issues. So it's been run with some NGOs around kind of issues for migrant and asylum seeker communities. It's been run with groups who are working with traveler and Roma communities. It's been run with groups who are maybe working with people who are experiencing long-term unemployment. Basically, the Changing Ireland part of that title is always basically responding to the needs of community workers on the ground. And basically, what we're doing with the certificate program now is that we have a cohort of 24 community workers and youth workers. Some of them have been doing the work for decades. Some of them haven't even been in the country for 12 months, but they're already really involved in their communities. And what we're doing basically is upskilling them, both in kind of community work and community work values and the kind of work that we're striving to do. Because what's often said is community work isn't just any work within a community. Again, it's always attached to that kind of creating that collective, creating the conditions for collective empowerment, identifying those structural oppressions and inequalities. And we're always kind of working to kind of move inequality a little bit further away, basically. And what we're doing basically is we're revisiting community work with these values, but also with a feminist approach to community work and bringing in that climate justice piece. So that, again, the project was basically in response to community workers saying, we want more information, we want to be more confident and more equipped to talk about the climate crisis. And so this certificate program is basically exactly that. It's upskilling those workers in those particular areas. We're also publishing research. We're having research done. We have a big piece of research that we did in collaboration with a team at UCC, University College Cork, that we're going to be releasing next month on April 11th. And it's basically a baseline review of Irish climate policy and its impacts on women and girls, but also on other marginalized and disadvantaged communities in Ireland. And basically, as I've said, that we're missing, we have a lot of data and policy gaps. What we hope this will do is basically start to fill that gap. And so when kind of government parties are saying, we need the data in order to write this policy, we can finally hand them something and say, here's some of the data. Now let's start kind of having the policy conversations and how we pay more attention to kind of the gendered piece, but also to any piece related to identity-based disadvantage. We're also creating toolkits for community workers. We're making them in conjunction with some of our CERT students who are community workers, but we also plan on bringing in community workers outside of that certificate program. And basically, we have two toolkits. One of them is around kind of feminist approaches to organizing and activism, and the other one is about kind of climate proofing of communities, basically assessing the communities, kind of what the risks might be, and seeing if we might be able to kind of basically adapt them so that those impacts aren't as severe or they aren't felt at all. And we're designing these in conjunction with community workers because they're going to be the ones using them. And so we want them basically to be as easy to use, as practical for the people who will be using them on the ground as possible, and that they live on far beyond the scope of the project to be continuously used. And then finally, another kind of key piece of the project is the Feminist Communities for Climate Justice National Network. And basically, this is going to be a space where we have all kinds of people, groups, communities, and individuals, NGOs, who are interested in advancing climate justice. Like, you know, we have academics, we have community groups, we have big NGOs, we have small NGOs, we have people who have been involved in climate stuff for years and years. We have people who haven't even gotten around to climate stuff but want to get started. And really what we want it to be is a peer learning, peer sharing space where we share stuff about, like, you know, information about particular topics on the climate crisis, opportunities for funding for particular projects at a community level, just a big knowledge share space. And we also want to get the groups in that network involved in the policy positions that we put together as a project, because that's also going to be a key part, and that we make submissions to things like when the climate action plan comes out, or when there's new kind of curricula to come out relating to, like, you know, climate and sustainability at, like, you know, the primary level, the secondary level, at third level education. we want to make sure that the climate justice angle is always kind of paid attention to in these pieces. But we don't just want it to come from us. We want it to come from the people who make up our network as well, so that a broad variety of voices are represented. So that's just some of the stuff that we're doing anyway.
So a lot of advocacy, education, and learning yourselves, sounds like.
Oh, absolutely.
Well, it sounds like you guys are doing a lot of great work, and I really appreciate you sharing, all this information. We've kind of talked about, the things that can be done to improve life for a lot of folks who are suffering from disproportionately from the impacts of these environmental challenges we're facing. But is there anything that we haven't specifically touched on, or that you would add, as far as actions that maybe we can advocate for, or if we're in positions, working to make these changes, that we can help with, specifically, or encourage our elected officials to maybe look into, to kind of make the transition more just for everyone?
I think really key to that, to making that transition just, is filling those data gaps. And there are some countries who are doing, who are far further ahead in this conversation. But again, if we want to make good evidence-based policy, it's about making sure we have that data in the first place. We can't make good evidence-based policy on women's experience of the climate crisis if we haven't gone out and actually gathered the data on how women are experiencing the climate crisis right now. So that's not just for kind of our decision makers, but it's about kind of taking that into academic spaces. It's even about encouraging citizen science and asking people to collect the experiences at the community level, at the citizen level, about how they're kind of finding the impacts of the climate crisis and collating these kinds of data, and not just kind of going to the typical forms of data where we're talking about percentages, we're talking about bar charts and census and stuff like that. It's about creating, curating the kind of the lived experience, the place-based experience, the kind of emotive experience, how you kind of feel the climate crisis is making you feel. When we talk about things like people feeling a sense of mourning or loss when they see the environment around them changing, or when there was a beach you went to as a child and suddenly the coast has come completely in and that literally doesn't exist anymore. It's about curating those kinds of experiences too, and making sure that they're seen as valuable. And another piece also that we would think of particularly for decision makers is better availability of public services. So healthcare, childcare, transport, housing. We find again, that community work approach, that victories for the collective will always outweigh victories for the individual, and that better public services tend to be better for women who are more reliant on public services. But also public services mean that you're likely not using as much disposable income to avail of them, and so that many groups who are socioeconomically disadvantaged can benefit from them. But it also means taking away kind of those vital services from private providers who might only be in it for profit, who might only be in it to see kind of portfolios, or stock grow and grow and grow, when we know that that constant economic growth is not compatible with kind of keeping our planet in a livable state. So it's about kind of creating that public service. And maybe probably the hardest conversation for state officials to admit is that running a public service means not expecting to make a profit on it every single time, and just allowing it to run for the good of the people. And then again, when we've talked about that thing about being able to afford the electric car, being able to afford to retrofit your home, making sure that when we design those grants, that we're designing them for people who will really benefit or really need those resources the most. So that, for example, we're not expecting an upfront payment for those grants. Maybe there's a sort of a loan scheme. Maybe there's an expectation that the government just has to kind of suck it up, for lack of a better term, and cough up a lot of money maybe in the here and now, and it becomes less expensive for them to maintain these kinds of things as time goes on, because we're talking about societal level change. It's going to be expensive whether they like it or not. And when we're talking about making sure the onus isn't always on the individual to do these things, the onus can't always be on the individual to buy the electric car or retrofit their house, because we're seeing right now that the majority of people, are simply not able to afford it. And that does have consequences for the government's own kind of carbon emissions reductions targets. Because if the majority of people can't afford to get an electric bike, or to walk, or they don't have good public transport, or they can't afford to swap from their, like, their oil, their solid fuels, their coals to electric heating, then that has consequences for their own, like, legally binding carbon emissions targets as well. And there's an onus on the state to help support such a level of change as well, because we've never really had to face a level of change as huge as this one. So um, another thing, again, is making sure that those MAPA groups are able to be in consultation spaces. And sometimes that does look like, can I bring my baby to the policy consultation space? Is the consultation space wheelchair accessible? Is it not always in Dublin city centre, for an Irish example? Is it sometimes out in the housing estates? Is it sometimes out in the flats? Is it sometimes out in the really rural areas? So that you're not always expecting these people to come to you, that you're going out to them and really showing that their consultation and opinion matters in these kinds of spaces. Um, and then again, that piece on valuing care, we need to make sure that care is kind of in those green job conversations again. It needs to be better paid. It needs to have better protections attached to it. And we need to stop seeing an erosion of these caring work protections and caring work wages. And then finally, and kind of a big piece for the Irish experience in particular, but one that does resonate, is that agricultural and farming transition. And that we're expecting a whole lot from farmers who, like small family farmers, who tend to be in competition with huge corporate farmers, huge corporate giants, who are kind of siphoning up a lot of the profit and not sharing much. And we can't expect kind of small family farmers to make the transition to green agriculture, to low carbon agriculture, to preservation of soils or certain forms of biodiversity and so on, if we're not paying them as much money as they're making now, or even more than they're making now, because we can't expect them again to make the change and not basically give them value for the really incredible work that they're doing in by making such a huge change in kind of what the status quo has been in agriculture for such a long time. Those are just a few examples that I can think of.
That's it. Just those simple few things. should be easy. Yeah, I mean, it's nobody's saying. Yeah, I think that the transition to a greener world is going to be quick or easy, but I think admitting that we need to be making some mindset shifts and kind of starting down the road, because there's so much resistance to even accepting that, like you said, this is probably one of the biggest societal shifts we're ever going to face. I mean, we've definitely had a lot of changes throughout history, but this is you're talking about not just shifting the way our energy is produced, but maybe even shifting, the type of the way our economy works, and slowing down from this constant growth trajectory, and maybe even reversing it, or at least halting the growth, which is considered,
taboo almost.
Yes, there you go, taboo. Nobody wants to think about that, but heaven forbid. But I mean, realistically, even if none of the other things in the world, if everything was perfect, the world was running great under this system, we don't physically have the resources on the planet to maintain the level of consumption. So for no other reason, if we don't care about people in their lives, we should at least be thinking about that. But
exactly.
What do I know? Well, you've given us an awful lot to think about, and I appreciate you sharing all your knowledge. If folks want to learn more about this topic, are there any resources you would share, books, podcasts, other ways to get information about any of these important subjects we've talked about today?
So I will say our own project has its own resource page, which is on our website, and I'll give you that website in just a moment. But we have the literature review that basically formed the base of the project. We released a chapter specifically around the interaction between care and climate change from our baseline review that's going to be released next month in April. But we released that care piece kind of up, like, a little earlier, because we think it's important to start having those conversations, and a lot of people don't make that connection. So we thought it would be an interesting one to kind of tease the rest of the baseline, if you will. But a few books that, and I think accessibility and language is important, because some of my background would be academic, and I think not everybody is going to want to read that kind of academic style, that academic language. but I find a book that I really enjoyed that kind of really explains kind of the colonial, like the implications of like colonization, the current kind of climate justice implications is not, it's not that radical, by Michaela Loach. And that's a book that I would happily recommend to everybody. It's so accessible. It has kind of her own human stories in it as well, but it also gives you kind of everything, the historical and contemporary aspects of the climate crisis and climate justice. Another one I'd recommend is The Intersectional Environmentalist by Leah Thomas. And that is a book, but it's also a website entirely dedicated to the intersectional approach to the climate crisis. So taking into account intersectional identities always in the approach. I would also recommend Diversifying Power by Jenny C. Stevens, which is a book about how we need to change basically who we're seeing in our decision-making spaces, particularly moving away from that pale male stale and maybe changing how power looks in our societies as well. And then finally, I would recommend for people who kind of want Climate Justice 101 and looking at the principles of climate justice from the Mary Robinson Foundation, who have been doing a lot of good work. And Mary Robinson continues to do a lot of good work as a member of the Elders group around climate justice in particular, was kind of a pioneer on the subject in this country anyway.
Yeah, I read her book. I think, yeah, I have it right there, Climate Justice by Mary Robinson. So very good read, and very quick and easy and inspirational for people who aren't sure, any progress is being made. It highlights mostly women, but some men around the world doing really important work. So I will second that one. Well, thank you for sharing all that, and we will link to the different books that you mentioned in the show notes for those that are interested. I guess we'll go ahead and move on to our Green Life Hack portion of the show, where we share a tip or a hack for folks who are looking for ways to implement more green practices into their own lives. So just, suggestions, little things you can do. So Vanessa, would you like to start us out?
I think really for my Green Life Hack, particularly in this kind of area, is to kind of read, watch, listen to books, podcasts, videos on this area, because I think particularly with this kind of area of climate justice, the fact that people don't know enough about it kind of allows the policy status quo to go unchanged. And I think it's about seeking out those resources and learning about those gendered impacts, or learning about the impacts for disabled people. I think that's kind of the key Green Life Hack I have here, because for some people, it's an entirely new conversation. And I think we need to make it so that it's not a new conversation, or that it's not something that people are completely taken aback by.
Yeah, I love that. And sometimes it's just a matter of admitting what you don't know, because you don't have a way of knowing the experience of someone else if you haven't ever had to go through it. So you may have been all for the straw bans, but not had any inkling that there was a population out there that needed those straws for whatever reason. And so it's just a matter of educating and listening, like you said. Well, my Green Life Hack is not quite so inspirational, but hopefully useful. I recently went on a short trip down to Cork, actually, and as I was packing my little bag full of travel size stuff, I do tend to now use refillable bottles, and so that got me thinking that's a great hack to share for those who maybe are still just kind of doing what they've always done and bought the travel size ones. Mm-hmm. So either, finish up what you have and either refill those bottles, or get refillable bottles and then fill them with your regular stuff, whether that's shampoo, soap, whatever, or switch to bars, something that you don't have to buy or in another package. So then you have multiple sizes of the same thing, essentially.
Yeah,
so that's my Green Life hack.
I went actually to London recently, and I went cheap. So I was I didn't check in a bag, and I needed to do the little liquid bottles. And I found if anybody's been to Lush and you've gotten a sample from Lush in those little pots, keep those tiny sample pots, because they are so useful for packing things like moisturizers or lotions.
Oh yeah,
things like that. I found that so helpful.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I keep those sometimes for, maybe I'll make something of my own, or, use it, like you said, to refill. But also we have a package-free shop in town. And so occasionally I'll take empty containers there because they have a spot for people who, want to leave or take stuff. So, lots of options to reuse when you're traveling. You don't always have to go and buy more stuff.
Exactly.
Well, Vanessa, thanks again for being on. And can you share where folks can find more about your organization and or yourself if you're so inclined, if they want to learn more?
So, the Feminist Communities for Climate Justice Project, we don't have a dedicated web page because we have our two project partners. So there's a dedicated page to us on the National Women's Council of Ireland website, and there's also a dedicated page to us on the Community Work Ireland website. And you can find them fairly easily, kind of from the front pages of those websites. You can find us on Twitter or X at NWCI for the National Women's Council, and then at ComWork Ireland for Community Work Ireland. The Women's Council is also on Instagram under National Women's Council of Ireland as well. And for myself, I'm on X still, unfortunately. I wonder if I should leave at this point. I'm under at Miss_Nessa_C.
Okay. Well, at least you're using the right terminology. I'm still saying Twitter because I can't I can't get past that name. But and again, we'll link to all that in the show notes if you're interested in learning more. You can find me personally here on Sustainably Geeky and occasionally on our sister shows, Epically and Marginally Geeky, and on Instagram and Twitter at Het's Gonna Be Me. And then you can find the show on all social media as well as YouTube and anywhere you listen to podcasts. So please check us out, subscribe, like us, share us, give us a thumbs up, whatever they let you do. We appreciate it. And if you have ideas for future show episodes, topics, guests, whatever, feel free to shoot us a message through any of those sites. So once again, thank you so much for being on. It was a lot of information, but like I said, it's going to give folks a lot to think about, and me especially. So I appreciate you sharing everything.
Having me on. This has been very cool.
Yeah, absolutely. For those listening, have a great rest of your day.